Welcome to Dialogue, the Deerfield Podcast where I sit down with members of the Academy community, near and far, guest speakers, and friends of our school to discuss topics relevant here on Old Main Street, across the U.S., and around the globe. Thank you for joining us. Today's guest is Jeffrey Rosen. Mr. Rosen is an American legal scholar and president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, the mission of which is to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis in order to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. His most recent book, The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton and Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America, was released in October. I had the opportunity to sit down with Mr. Rosen during his recent visit to Deerfield. Jeffrey Rosen, welcome. We're so glad you're here at Deerfield.
It's an honor to be here. So glad to be here.
So I loved your remarks today, both to the American Studies class and to the kids at school meeting about reading. And I wanted to begin by asking you about your grandfather's desk.
Well, the most treasured possession I have is a desk ornament that my grandfather gave to my dad. My grandfather died before I was born. He was a street peddler in Detroit, Michigan. He was an immigrant from Poland, from the anti-Semitic violence there. And he came to the U.S., and although he was a street peddler, he loved reading. And one day he passed the Detroit Public Library. A branch had just opened in 1932 in the middle of the Depression. And he was so inspired by the legend above the door that he carved the letters out of wood and glued them onto this desk sign that he gave to my dad. And it says, "The fountain of wisdom flows through books."
And he actually carved the letters and had them placed on the desk?
It's a desk sign that sort of stands up on a desk. Just a simple piece of wood. He carved the letters out by hand. The letters are kind of ragged because he did it by hand. One of the letters has fallen off because the glue wasn't perfect. He made toys on the side. The business went bust during the Depression. There was lead in the paint and so forth. He had a very tough life, but that he just valued reading so much that he took the time to glue the letters out one by one and gave them to my dad.
And how did you become a reader?
I was a reader ever since I was a kid. I was very fortunate to grow up at a time when there was nothing else to do on long car rides. And I very much remember reading so avidly in the car that when the door opened at the end of the trip, I'd fall out because I was still reading. I guess I have to thank my mom, who was a reader, as was my dad. And I told the story in the assembly today about going with my mom to the Library of Congress as a very young kid and being so inspired in that beautiful Thomas Jefferson building by the thought that all the books in the world were in the same place. But however I was fortunate enough to get it, it just became a habit. It just became something I did and took a lot of time with. I mean, would spend hours just reading. And then once you get into the habit, you can keep it up. I did get out of the habit of reading as an adult because I'm addicted to screens, and I still read for deadlines and could produce pieces related to work, but I'd gotten out of the habit of reading for stuff that wasn't related to deadlines. And that's why I'm so glad to have fallen into this unusual COVID project of reading moral philosophy for 2 hours a day, because it got me back into the habit of reading. And I found that is the most gratifying part of my life.
So not everyone spends their leisure time reading moral philosophy. How did that happen? What stimulated you to embark on reading through Jefferson's list of great books?
It was a series of synchronicities and then a reading list that started me on this unusual project. I was struck that both Franklin and Jefferson had chosen as their motto for happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. Franklin's excerpt was, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be," to illustrate his project of 13 virtues a day, which he suggests that we all try to practice by putting X marks next to one of the virtues where we've fallen short. And Franklin tried this for a while and then found it was very depressing because there were so many X marks and abandoned it, but was inspired by the project and chose Cicero as his motto. I noticed again, as through happenstance, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, right before COVID, and saw that on the wall of this great temple of Jeffersonism, there was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. And they look a lot like Franklin's, and they're all about resolution, do what you resolve, and resolve to do what you ought. But what was really striking about the list was that Jefferson also handed out an excerpt from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations to anyone who asked, including kids and a Maine schoolmaster, a headmaster at a Maine school who wanted the essence of happiness. And the excerpt that Jefferson quoted was longer, and it said essentially, he who has achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the calm and self-mastered man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man. So I was just so struck that both Franklin and Jefferson had chosen the Cicero book as their definition of happiness, not as pleasure-seeking, but as calm self-mastery or virtue-seeking, that I just thought I've got to read the Cicero, and then what else to read? And then finding a reading list by Jefferson that he sent widely to people who asked about how to be educated just blew my mind, because first the scope of the list with novels and science and history and law, but that moral philosophy section just jumped out at me. There were 10 books. At the top was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. It was like a golden talisman sort of inviting me to read further, like a key to Jefferson's mind. And then Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, and then Enlightenment philosophers, but it was their moral philosophy, not their political philosophy. Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Hutcheson's works, Bolingbroke, Hume, and Lord Kaimes. And I was just inspired to read the list because it was a gap in my education. I was struck that I hadn't read any of the books, and I've had this incredible education. I'm so grateful for it. But how could I have missed this? And also it was moral philosophy, and I was so eager for guidance, especially in college, about how to lead a good life by reason and reflection, not by force or dogma. The Puritans are so unsatisfying to me, and insisting through double predestination that not only is salvation or damnation predestined before our birth, and that no amount of good works or faith can affect it, but also that we can only achieve salvation through faith defined as the acceptance of authority of the church. And that was not consistent with my powers of reason. I wanted to think for myself. Then I learned that John Milton, the great Puritan independent, he wasn't a dissenter, reached the same conclusion. And during the English Civil War, thought that truth has nothing to fear from error as long as reason is free to combat it. And that therefore, laws banning books and imposing licensing agreements, which Parliament, the Puritan Parliament, having denounced and killed the king for its illiberalism, then practiced it himself. Milton said that this was a violation of our basic rights of conscience. So I felt like I had to read the books, and I did. And goodness knows why. We did have more time, and it was COVID. And it was just kind of something I thought I should do for myself. I had no intention of writing more about it. But then the habits came, and I followed Jefferson's schedule, and that turns to be crucial, although kind of crazy, to wake up early and read moral philosophy for 2 hours and watch the sunrise. And it was just the habit of, it was something I had to do because I'd started, that led me to keep doing it. And it was very life-changing. First, I was glad to find out I could actually understand it. I thought I studied political philosophy and law, but thought that I wasn't good on analytical philosophy, and I didn't know moral philosophy, and that I wouldn't. But just taking time with it, I figured I could figure out what they were saying. I developed the confidence to realize that I could grasp it and to give it the time. And then the lesson was just life-changing, that happiness is about being good, not feeling good, which means really it's a psychological as well as a spiritual quest, trying to keep focus, not get distracted by unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, and basically tune in and learn so you can share and contribute to something larger than yourself. So that was the takeaway, as they say. It's sort of funny to reduce it all to that. But the biggest takeaway was just getting back into the habit of reading. Once I started reading that deeply, I wanted to do more and develop this new rule that I have to read in the morning before I browse or surf. And that's been really life-changing. So I've become an evangelist for
So you've kept that
deep
up.
reading.
Like
I
you
have.
continue with this new reading regime that you kind of reinvented for yourself during COVID.
I have. I'm not getting up 2 hours before dawn, and I'm not even always catching the sunrise. I'm not, but I have a rule that I have to read before I browse or surf, for at least until breakfast, but a half hour, an hour, and that's what's life changing. I was able to write the Hamilton Jefferson book because of this rule. And now it's just become a habit. And I'm still tempted every morning to check email. But now that I've become a virtue monger going around talking about the power of reading, I feel like I've got to do it. So I do. And then you just learn something every day. It's just so cool. And and the fact that it's all on Kindle just blows my mind, because you just wake up and you pull out your device and you read something. It's just marvelous.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite virtue of Franklin's 13?
Silence. Think before you speak.
Yeah.
That was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's advice as well. She had this very unusual conversation pattern. When you interviewed her, you'd ask her a question and she'd pause for a really long time before you answered. And if you didn't know her, people would just jump in and try to fill the noise because it was so awkward. And I once asked her, why do you pause so long before you speak? And she said, I like to think before I speak. And it's just so empowering to do that.
I've gotten a sense from some of the things that you've said that maybe prior to COVID, you felt like your capacity as a reader had slowly eroded over time, and that you recaptured that, took the opportunity of COVID to recapture that. Is that accurate? And are you at all worried? I mean, it seems to me like your project at the National Constitution Center is in some fundamental and important way, it's about deep literacy. It's about reading. It's about the philosophic tradition that you just described. Are you worried that print is going to lose out to screens, and that's going to, it may already be playing out in ways that's not healthy for the Republic?
Absolutely. The fact that people aren't reading is an existential threat to the Republic. I absolutely was prey to this. First, even before the rise of social media, just focusing only on reading for my deadlines and the topics I was writing about rather than reading more broadly. And then once the screen addiction set in, just browsing, surfing, and convincing myself that browsing the news was the same as reading a book. And it's not at all.
Yeah.
Jefferson said, I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better. Tacitus, the historian, was his favorite of all authors. And browsing snippets of information is not the same as the reading that produces deep knowledge. So I was victim to this. And obviously all of us are, and not just those who lack educational opportunities, but the most privileged among us. And and it's not just print to screens, it's what we watch on the screens. The move from blogs to TikTok was really not great for deep reading. And of course, Instagram and an image-based culture. And most important of all, just not taking time with text to read books. And however you define it, we all know the difference between a book and a blog or a video. So without deep reading and listening to competing points of view, we'll lose the Republic. And at the Constitution Center, we're on a crusade to inspire deep reading.
So you said you read on a Kindle?
Yeah.
So do you not take notes when you read?
I definitely do. That's why I love Kindle, because you can highlight.
You highlight on your Kindle.
I'm
demonstrating my technological illiteracy here.
I was skeptical too, because I'm a Luddite, obviously, in all respects. But the two things about the Kindle are remarkable. First, that you can carry it around with you, and I have all the books in the world just here, and I can find them, so I can read at any time, and I do on trains and planes and automobiles, and it vastly increases especially if you travel, you carry all the library of the world around with you, and you can highlight in different colors and put footnotes, and then go back and find the footnotes and also cut and paste the highlighted portions directly onto your document. So if you write, as I do, only around primary text, and I
Yes.
never will write anything unless I can ground it in a direct quotation from a primary text, the Kindle is ideal in
Yeah.
a way that you could never do in a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like you have a very good memory. Do you actively commit passages to memory? Like you seem like you can quote Madison and Milton and others. Like it's on the tip of your tongue.
It's like a weird party trick after you've done it a few times. I don't set out to memorize it, but I find just thinking about it, and then I have to write about it. Once I've written about a passage, it gets into my head, and at some point I can repeat it. Yeah.
I'm very curious about your work at the National Constitution Center. Is Constitution Day and Citizenship Day, do you feel like it's finding traction, particularly among schools in the country?
Constitution Day, September 17th.
You're here for Constitution Day, by the way, except we're celebrating it in November because that's how it worked out.
Better late than never.
Yeah.
Constitution Day, of course, should be every day of the year, but Senator Byrd and Congress made the commemoration of Constitution Day some sort of federal requirement a few years ago, and it's widely celebrated, and it's inspiring to see it so. And amidst all of our culture wars about how to teach history and the degree to which so many of these questions have become politicized, it's inspiring that there's a day and a focus every year when people of different perspectives can come to celebrate the Constitution.
Are schools doing it in any ways that you find interesting or inspiring?
Any conversation about the Constitution on Constitution Day, you just want a deep, rigorous conversation. I do have to, at this point, share my enthusiasm for and plug the astonishing resources of the National Constitution Center, which are a great way to celebrate Constitution Day every day. Might I do that?
Please, go ahead.
I couldn't possibly.
Absolutely.
It's just so extraordinary to host online the amazing interactive Constitution. In 2015, we launched this incredible learning platform. It's now among the most Googled constitutions in the world with 90 million hits. And the idea was to bring together the top liberal and conservative scholars in America, nominated by the Conservative Federalist Society and the Liberal American Constitution Society, to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So you can see Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words about what they agree the habeas corpus clause means, and then separate statements about what they disagree about. Multiply that by 80 clauses, 160 scholars. It's this extraordinarily modeling of agreement and disagreement about every part of the Constitution. And then we took that model and have applied it through all of our educational resources. So I host a weekly podcast, We the People, that brings together liberals and conservatives to have conversations about constitutional issues. We have a Constitution 101 class that we've just launched with Khan Academy that brings together the greatest liberal and conservative constitutional scholars and historians to teach Constitution 101. We have wonderful public programs that model this conversation, and this amazing new interactive Declaration of Independence that just launched for America 250, with great historians of different perspectives on the big ideas of the Declaration and Constitution, an annotation of the Constitution clause by clause by Professor Akil Amar, my dear teacher, who I think you've had here at Deerfield. I'm so glad you've experienced his great learning and light. Biographies of the framers by Carol Birkin, and questions for learners of all ages to discuss around the dinner table and around the country. This toolkit will be published as a paperback by Simon & Schuster this year.
Oh, great.
And we're taking this model of the interactive Declaration and Constitution, which we call the Civic Toolkit, and trying to inspire conversations about the Constitution across America in schools like Deerfield, as well as public schools and charter schools, in community centers and libraries and rural bookstores. And we have this great partnership with a foundation that's sponsoring us to go out to rural bookstores in places like Cooksville, Tennessee, or Elkhart, Indiana, and convene community members to talk about the civic toolkit and the Constitution from diverse perspectives where they are. There's nothing more inspiring for me than doing this. Just the privilege of going to communities like Cooksville, where I went last year, or Elkhart, Indiana, where a guy called Frank Martin convened 500 people in a local church to talk about the ideals of the Constitution Declaration, is, first of all, an affirmation of the vitality of the American idea, a reminder that there's no red and blue America when it comes to the Constitution. There's one America, and people are devoted to debating and learning about these ideals. And has also showed me that if we can just get past talking about politics, about which there's no possibility of agreement in a polarized age, there's much light that can be shed in conversations about history and the Constitution. My experience is that our political opinions are the least interesting part of us. I have the great great privilege of having a job where I'm not allowed to have political opinions anymore, and it's incredibly liberating. It's just good for my digestion, and also I'm bored by my own opinions. I lost interest in them. But to the Constitution, these are complicated, interesting questions.
Yes.
There are good arguments on both sides. And just to have the honor of convening these conversations on different platforms and also using technology to amplify them is a very meaningful role.
I know you love quoting the mission statement of the Constitution Center.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you to do that because there's one word in it which you've alluded to that I want to ask you about. But go ahead, give me the mission statement.
I couldn't possibly. The only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the U.S. Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis.
So I want to ask you about the word nonpartisan.
Yes.
You've kind of mentioned that. Like, how do you, first of all, what does it mean to you? And how do you operationalize through the work of the Constitution Center a nonpartisan approach to teaching about the Constitution, particularly during a moment of like intense polarization and division?
Nonpartisan for the Constitution Center means two things. One, we do not talk about politics. We only talk about constitutional arguments and historical arguments. And second, that we convene real liberals and real conservatives for conversations about those questions. So what does it mean to talk about constitutional arguments and not political arguments? We don't talk about, is gun control a good or bad idea, but does the Second Amendment allow or forbid it? And when you do it through that lawyer's lens, you open up the possibility that you might reach a constitutional conclusion that diverges from your political views. You might think gun control is good, but the Second Amendment forbids it, or gun control is bad, and the Second Amendment allows it. That's the lens that I use to teach constitutional law. It might seem radical or kind of weird to have the faith that citizens of all ages, starting in middle school, can separate their political from their constitutional views. But we found first that it's the way to be nonpartisan, to keep politics out of the discussion, because it inspires people to dig in deep and learn before they express opinions, to educate themselves. And starting in very young ages, we found that middle school kids actually can do this. On one Zoom during COVID, we were teaching live to middle school, and a young student put in the chat, Bill, I'm 11. I'm not sure I can read the dissent, because I always inspire people to read the majority opinion and the dissent. And I said, I know you can do it. And he could, as you know, with being a great teacher, and all of your colleagues who are a great teacher knows that if you just take time with the material and sometimes read it out loud together, starting at a very young age, people can do it. So that's our approach to being nonpartisan, to only discuss constitutional and not political arguments, and to bring together liberals and conservatives.
Are you ever accused of taking partisan positions on the Constitution?
Well, we don't take positions. That's another crucial thing.
Yes.
No statements, no positions. No one cares what I think or the National Constitution Center thinks about an issue. We will present a conversation about it. I'm really struck. It's kind of amazing, and knock wood, and maybe there's some providence at issue here. We've never been seriously attacked by either side. Of course, there's stuff in the chat of YouTube videos sometimes, or not all of sometimes our programs will just be a single guest. We have a liberal or a conservative, and some people don't like that. But knock wood, it works so far because people respect it. There's no mystery about what we're doing. We're just trying to bring people together of different perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like most of the time you're staging conversations.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one question I have, and it seems to be kind of the question that's in the air, is there's been a lot of interest of late around the amendment process. And even the project that the great project that you embarked on with the three teams, the libertarians, the progressives, and the conservatives, kind of reframing and rewriting the Constitution, seems to be of a piece with this. But there's a lot of interest in changing the Constitution, amending the Constitution, a lot of discussion about how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. And I think one of the questions I'm curious about is, behind that debate seems to be a bigger question, which is the Constitution that was written 250 years ago up to the moment? Is it up to the challenges that the country faces right now? Or do we need to call a second constitutional convention and just rewrite it?
It was striking that the project you mentioned, where the Constitution Center brought together liberal, conservative, and progressive thinkers, none of them proposed to tear down the Constitution. They wanted to amend it. But what's most striking is that the amendments were not having to do with individual rights or fundamental structural change. The most significant ones, or all of them, there were 5, really had to do with promoting deliberation. And that's when you ask what Madison was trying to achieve, it was to slow down deliberation and make possible government by conversation and persuasion. And to the degree that we're in a real trouble now, it's ways that technology and polarization have assaulted government by conversation. So if that's the problem, then the solution isn't necessarily a whole starting from scratch or a whole slew of amendments to achieve this or that policy result, but ways of resurrecting government by conversation and deliberation. Our teams proposed resurrecting the legislative veto, which would allow Congress to reject executive orders by majority vote. There's a good example of a concrete amendment that would empower Congress to do its job, which is to make its own views clear in opposition to the executive. Other proposals that seem to me most promising include reinvigorating the committee system within Congress, regular order, so that people have to deliberate, both parties, and that the speaker can't just rubber stamp what the president does without any deliberation. That second reform doesn't require a constitutional amendment. It requires Congress reforming its rules. So I would focus on what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And it seems pretty obvious that the problem is the great problem the founders feared, which was faction and being governed by passion rather than reason.
Yeah.
And if the solution is deliberation, then there are ways of promoting deliberation that don't involve a constitutional amendment.
Yeah. And what about the amendment process itself? Do you think that can be altered or changed or improved? Or
our bipartisan or multi-partisan teams all thought that amendment should be at least a little bit easier.
Yeah.
And they tweaked it to make it a little easier to reflect the will of the majority, getting around the vagaries of the state ratification system. But it was a pretty technical tweak. So they weren't proposing to make it majority vote. And it was important to the framers that an amendment be harder to pass than an ordinary law, so that you could be sure that it actually represents the considered, deliberate views of we the people rather than their momentary passions. So it could be tweaked, but the difficulty of tweaking it requires going through the current process. So for all those reasons, the idea of the unlikely possibility of slightly tweaking the current process to make that process only a little bit easier doesn't seem to me like the most urgent thing we got to focus on.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about your new book, and congratulations, The Pursuit of Liberty. That I'll let you articulate the argument, but one of the things it seems to be doing is describing this essential tension between two of the great founders, Hamilton and Jefferson. and how it extends. You describe it as a metaphorical thread through our history. And I was wondering if you could describe the argument of the book a little bit, and then maybe talk about how it's playing out in the Supreme Court later today, in regards to the tariff case.
The argument of the book is that Hamilton and Jefferson's early clashes over national power versus states' rights, and executive versus judicial power, and democracy versus rule by elites, and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution have defined all of American history. And those battles played out for them over questions like how strong the president should be and whether or not Congress can charter a bank. And those big questions on the power of the presidency involved the question of whether or not the convention was creating a crypto Caesar, a kind of dictatorial monarch who could subvert the republic. And Hamilton, who favors strong executive power, wants no term limits. And Jefferson, who wants to constrain executive power, wants a 1-year term limit. But both are afraid of this Caesar-like demagogue. And those debates are still playing out today as we debate whether or not President Trump is or is not the Caesar-like demagogue the founders feared. And then when it comes to the debate over the bank, the question was whether or not Congress could charter the Bank of the United States, which was the centerpiece of Hamilton's financial plan. And Hamilton says yes and wants to liberally construe the Constitution to allow Congress to adopt any means that are appropriate or useful for carrying out its enumerated ends, like promoting the general welfare or passing taxes. Jefferson says no, he wants to strictly construe the Constitution to allow Congress only to exercise explicitly enumerated powers and those that are absolutely necessary to carrying them out. And Hamilton wins. George Washington sides with him over Jefferson and signs the bill authorizing the Bank of the United States. Chief Justice John Marshall, in the McCulloch v. Maryland case, also not only sides with Hamilton, but paraphrases him word for word because he has Hamilton's memo by his side. He's writing George Washington's biography, and he has Washington's papers given to him by Bushrod Washington, Washington's nephew. And there's the Hamilton memo. So he just paraphrases it in this opinion and says, let the end be legitimate, any means that are appropriate or conducive to carrying out or consistent with the Constitution. And that liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution is the essential debate throughout our history. It's not between originalism and non-originalism, but between liberal and strict construction of the Constitution. And that's the debate that defines the debate over the constitutionality of the post-Reconstruction Civil Rights Acts and the Civil Rights era Reconstruction Civil Rights Acts. It's the debate over the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise that led up to the Civil War. And it's the essence of the debates we're having on executive power today before the court. So just to come right to the present, as you suggest, later today, or actually this morning.
Yeah.
Maybe still the arguments
as
may
we
still
speak.
be as we speak. Neil Katyal, I'm sending him good thoughts because he's my brother-in-law, so I'm allowed to have sides within the family, although they're not, they're just personal opinions. He's arguing that the tariffs are beyond the statute that President Trump has invoked to authorize them. And Neil, in this case, wants to strictly construe the word emergency to mean what he says Congress intended when it passed the Tariff Act, and it wanted to prevent the presidents from lightly passing tariffs and limit them to actual emergencies that threaten national security. Neil will argue that the border crossings at Mexico are not a national emergency and therefore there shouldn't be tariffs. And he's also arguing that Congress can't delegate broad bits of authority, even if it wants to. Its powers should be strictly construed, and that if Congress is addressing a major question of constitutional law, it's got to say so specifically and clearly rather than give the president a blank check. It's amazing how Jeffersonian all this is, and also striking that Neil Katyal will be appealing to the more Jeffersonian justices who in other cases have strictly construed congressional power to not allow the delegation of power and to require it to speak clearly with major questions. This was the same strict construction that they deployed to strike down President Biden's loan forgiveness program. And Neil will argue, turnabout is fair play, be consistent, and apply that to President Trump. And his opponents on the other side will be Hamiltonian and will be discovering the virtues of implied powers and liberal construction, and will say that emergency should be interpreted broadly, as President Trump claims. As always, we'll see.
So it's going to, a lot of it's going to turn on this one word, the reading of the word emergency and
yes.
what that means.
So striking.
Yeah.
Just as the Missouri Compromise turned on the meaning of the word territories,
Yes.
and the bank case turned on the word necessary, it's really striking how our most fundamental, important, and contested constitutional questions often turn on the construction of a single word. And you don't have to be a lawyer or any sort of specially trained person to construe the word territories, for example. Chief Justice Taney strikes down the Missouri Compromise on the grounds that when Congress gives the power to regulate the territory, it's because it's singular, it only includes the territory held by the U.S. at the time the Constitution was drafted. The other side says that's silly. It could include future acquired territories. Who's right? Goodness knows. Often it's just like, do you say the word in one tone of voice rather than another? Territories doesn't tell you. In a sense, you could call them word games at their worst. This sort of very Jesuitical parsing of the text, which is the Jeffersonian prescription, is really just being deployed for the purpose of constricting power. It's wanting to forbid the exercise of any implied powers unless they're literally written out word for word.
Yeah.
The thing is that this was rejected at the convention. There were early drafts of the necessary and proper clause that would have said absolutely necessary or explicitly enumerated. And Madison himself, who's always in between Hamilton and Jefferson, rejects that and says you can't run a government without implied powers. It was really a later Jeffersonian backlash that invoked this approach of strict construction, and throughout history, followers of John Marshall have preferred liberal or fair construction as the Madisonian Compromise. But again, there's nothing in particular in the original understanding that tells you which to choose. There was no original understanding. There's a debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, and people have been continuing it ever since.
Mm. So I understand that the pursuit of happiness was part one of what's eventually going to be a trilogy of books, with the pursuit of liberty as number two, and the third is going to be, if I've done my homework, the pursuit of union.
Yes, thank you for discovering.
I'm curious about what that's going to be.
I'm so excited. This is what I'm doing my morning reading for. The idea is how James Madison and the forgotten founders defined the Constitutional Convention and defined America. And the forgotten founders who were most influential at the convention, took me a while to figure them out. I was reading around and talking with my colleagues, and then I found this list. Who spoke most frequently at the Constitutional Convention? And that's a really good list. It starts with Gouverneur Morris, who speaks more than anyone else.
Really?
Yes, indeed. Then Madison, then James Wilson, then Roger Sherman of Connecticut. So it's got to be those four guys. But then...
Didn't Hamilton speak for 6 straight hours when he introduced his plan? I mean,
totally. But then he left because he's got legal business in New York, and he's also... his attentions are divided. So he's not among the most frequent speakers throughout the convention. In addition to those 4 guys, we have to have someone from South Carolina, because it was South Carolina that was more responsible than any other state for refusing to sign unless the international slave trade was extended until 1808, and also was at the heart of the infamous compromises over slavery. So John Rutledge will be my 4th guy. I want to tell the stories, the human stories that define these founders, in addition to the clash of their ideas about union. And I start with the story that got me into the book, which is the contrast between George Wythe and John Rutledge, the murder and the suicide. So George Wythe is Thomas Jefferson's law tutor, and he's the most admired law teacher in America. Teaches at William and Mary. He is an anti-slavery Virginia delegate who writes an early opinion for the Virginia Supreme Court striking down slavery. He goes to the Constitutional Convention as a delegate, comes up with a rule that forbids tweeting or reading during other speeches, but then he has to go home because his wife is ill. She's very, very ill. He goes home. Tragically, she dies. A few weeks later, Wythe takes into his house he frees his enslaved housekeeper, Lydia Broadnax, and he lives with her as his housekeeper. And then he takes into his home an African-American boy called Michael, and he raises Michael as his own kid. And he tells in his will, if anything happens to me, I want you to take care of Michael. I'm going to educate him just as I would my own son. Some think that he was Wythe's son because he lived with him and Broadnax. Other things, Broadnax was too old. She was 50. It could have been his son by another woman. But in any event, he raises the kid. Then he takes into his home who should arrive but George McSweeney, his wicked, wastrel nephew. McSweeney is a drunk and a gambler, and he's just a bad guy. And he notices the will where Wythe has left half of his property to Lydia Broadnax and Michael, and the other half to George McSweeney. So Sweeney decides to poison Wythe and Broadnax and Michael. And Broadnax sees him put this white powder in the coffee they have in the morning, and then they all drink the coffee and become deathly ill and mortally ill. And Wythe exclaims, "I am murdered," and he and Michael die. Broadnax miraculously survives. McSweeney should be dead to rights because she saw him do it. But in Virginia, black people can't testify against white people. So Wythe is acquitted. And although McSweeney is acquitted, Wythe wrote him out of his will, but it's a remarkable story of the virtuous founder devoted to freedom who wants to educate a black son and ultimately is murdered for it. Contrast that story, if I may, and I'll try to do it fast, with that of the suicide, John Rutledge. John Rutledge is one of the biggest enslavers in South Carolina. He's devoted to preserving slavery. He's called King John during the Revolution because South Carolina gives him so much power. He goes to the Constitutional Convention and he single-handedly insists they won't sign without the international slave trade being extended until 1808. And he does a deal with Connecticut, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, that the international slave trade will be extended in exchange for New England being able to pass navigation acts by majority rather than 2/3, which is what Sherman really wants. So he and Gouverneur Morris denounces slavery as immoral, and Rutledge says morality's got nothing to do with it, it's pure interest. Then the convention's over. He really wants to be Chief Justice. That's his main ambition. But Washington first appoints James Wilson, another framer, and then he appoints John Jay. And Rutledge is furious and he's jealous and he denounces the Jay Treaty, which doesn't compensate the enslaving states for their slaves who defected during the Revolutionary War. And he says that he'd rather Washington die than sign the Jay Treaty. He doesn't know that Washington has appointed him to the Supreme Court a few weeks earlier to succeed Jay. Then the word gets out. The Senate finds out that he's delivered the speech denouncing the Jay Treaty. They suspect that he's gone mad, and they refuse to confirm him permanently as Chief Justice. He's so despondent. He's raging. He goes to South Carolina, and he throws himself in the river, and he wants to kill himself. Then a barge of 2 enslaved people goes by, and they fish him out of the river. And he says, "It's not illegal to try to kill yourself. I know that. I'm a judge." And they nevertheless save his life against his wishes, and he spends the rest of his days in despondency and madness. So that great contrast, they're just great stories. And I just thought the murder and the suicide, and once again, these are stories I just didn't know because we study law, but not history, even as those of us who have had the privilege of studying a lot of law and a lot of history. So telling the stories of the forgotten founders and then contrasting their views about union, which are so different and so crucial, I think will be a great way of telling the story of the Constitutional Convention.
Sounds like a great book. I look forward to reading it when it comes out.
Thank you.
So, Jeffrey Rosen, thank you for being here. It's been such a pleasure having you at Deerfield. And thank you for speaking to the kids.
Great pleasure for me too. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.